My name is Madison Carter, and I'm 28 years old. Standing on these courthouse steps, watching my parents Richard and Helen Carter shake their heads at me like I'm some pathetic joke, I can still hear my father's words echoing, "You'll never amount to anything without our name and money." They're rolling their eyes as I clutch the lawsuit documents against them, confident they'll crush me in court today. But what they don't know is that I have evidence that will destroy everything they've built on lies and stolen dreams. The moment I speak my first words to that judge, their world will crumble. Before we dive into this incredible journey of family betrayal and ultimate justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, smash that like button if you're ready for a story that will leave you speechless, and don't forget to subscribe because this tale of revenge and redemption is just getting started. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, in a world of privilege that was actually a prison. Growing up on our sprawling Connecticut estate, I thought I was living the American dream. The Carter mansion sat on 50 acres of manicured lawns, complete with tennis courts, a swimming pool, and enough guest bedrooms to house a small hotel. Every morning, I woke up to fresh flowers arranged by our housekeeper, breakfast prepared by our personal chef, and a schedule meticulously planned by my mother Helen. From the outside, we were the perfect family. From the inside, I was suffocating. My parents controlled every aspect of my existence with surgical precision. At age 5, they enrolled me in etiquette classes. By 10, I was attending charity galas in designer dresses, learning to smile prettily while adults discussed business deals I couldn't understand. My 16th birthday party wasn't a celebration but a networking event where potential suitors were paraded before me like I was livestock at an auction. The guest list included only children from families my parents deemed appropriate, which meant wealthy, connected, and willing to merge assets through marriage. College was supposed to be my escape, but even Harvard was chosen for me. My father Richard, a man who measured success only in dollar signs, decided I would study business administration. When I timidly mentioned my dream of attending law school, both parents laughed until tears streamed down their faces. "Lawyers are servants, darling," my mother said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "We hire them. We don't become them." The conversation ended there, like so many others, with my dreams dismissed as childish fantasies. During my junior year at Harvard, they introduced me to James Wellington, heir to the Wellington banking fortune. Our first meeting was orchestrated at a charity auction, where James bid $50,000 on a weekend in the Hamptons just to have an excuse to ask me on a date. He was handsome in that polished, country club way, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Our courtship followed a script written by our parents, complete with chaperone dinners, supervised weekend trips, and carefully photographed social events that always ended up in the society pages. What I didn't realize until much later was that James and my parents held private meetings about our relationship. They discussed our future like a business merger, which it essentially was. The Wellington banking empire needed the Carter real estate connections, and my parents needed Wellington's financial expertise for their increasingly complex investment schemes. I was simply the asset that would seal the deal. My first real glimpse behind the curtain came during a dinner party at our estate. I was supposed to be upstairs preparing for bed, but I heard raised voices coming from my father's study. Creeping down the back staircase, I positioned myself outside the partially open door and heard my father discussing something about moving the foundation money offshore before the audit. My mother's voice was sharp with worry. "If they discover what we've done with those cancer research donations, we'll lose everything." James's voice joined the conversation, suggesting they use my name on several bank accounts to spread the liability. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd heard. Cancer research donations? Offshore accounts? Using my name without my knowledge? The perfect life I'd been living suddenly felt like a house of cards built on other people's suffering. But I was young, scared, and completely dependent on my parents financially. I convinced myself I'd misunderstood the conversation. The truth became impossible to ignore when I discovered that my law school applications had been systematically sabotaged. I'd applied to Yale, Columbia, and NYU law schools with grades and test scores that should have guaranteed acceptance. When rejection letters arrived from all three schools, I was devastated. It wasn't until months later that I learned my father had personally called the admissions offices, claiming I was mentally unstable and withdrawing my applications on my behalf. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Instead of law school, I was pressured into an engagement with James. The proposal happened at another charity gala, orchestrated down to the photographer who captured my surprised expression when James dropped to one knee. The ring was enormous, a 5-carat diamond surrounded by sapphires that probably cost more than most people's houses. As hundreds of guests applauded, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. This wasn't my choice, my timing, or my dream. This was my parents' business plan with me as the unwilling participant. The engagement period should have been the happiest time of my life, but instead, I felt like I was drowning in designer wedding dress fittings and catering tastings. Every decision was made by committee, with my mother, James's mother, and our wedding planner discussing my preferences as if I wasn't in the room. When I suggested a small ceremony, they laughed and showed me the guest list of 800 people. When I asked about postponing the wedding to travel or find myself, my father's face turned purple with rage. "You will not embarrass this family," he thundered. "The Wellingtons are expecting a spring wedding, and that's exactly what they'll get." During this suffocating period, I began documenting everything I could. Initially, it was just a diary where I vented my frustrations, but gradually it became something more strategic. I started photographing documents left carelessly around the house, recording conversations when my parents thought I was out of earshot, and making copies of suspicious paperwork. I told myself I was gathering evidence of their controlling behavior, maybe for a future therapist or support group. I had no idea I was building a case that would eventually destroy them. The breaking point came when I discovered they'd been forging my signature on foundation documents for years. Hidden in a locked drawer in my father's desk, I found bank statements showing millions of dollars flowing through the Carter Family Foundation, supposedly dedicated to children's cancer research. But the money wasn't going to hospitals or research facilities. It was being funneled into personal investment accounts, luxury real estate purchases, and offshore banking schemes. My forged signature appeared on every transfer authorization, making me legally responsible for their crimes without my knowledge or consent. Wedding planning became a masterclass in manipulation and control that would have impressed the most ruthless dictators. Every detail was scrutinized, approved, or rejected based on how it would benefit the Carter-Wellington Business Alliance. The venue had to be the most exclusive country club in Connecticut. The guest list read like a who's who of American wealth and political power. My wedding dress, chosen without my input, cost more than most people's annual salaries and made me look like a princess in a fairy tale I never wanted to be part of. What shattered my last remaining illusions about James happened 3 weeks before our scheduled wedding. I'd convinced myself that even if our relationship started as a business arrangement, we'd developed genuine feelings for each other. James was attentive, charming, and seemed to understand my frustration with my parents' controlling nature. He'd even suggested we could travel to Europe after the wedding, maybe live abroad for a while to establish our independence. I was clinging to these promises like a lifeline when I overheard a phone conversation that destroyed everything. James was in our garden, walking near the rose bushes while talking on his cell phone. He didn't realize I was reading on a bench hidden behind the gazebo when he started speaking to someone about our relationship. "The contract requires the marriage to last at least 5 years, he said, his voice carrying the cold calculation of a business transaction. "After that, we can divorce quietly. The parents have already agreed to the financial arrangements. Madison gets enough money to keep her comfortable and quiet, and I maintain access to the Carter real estate portfolio." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Do I care about her? She's pleasant enough, but this was always about the money. Richard Carter is paying me $12 million to marry his daughter and keep her under control. It's the easiest money I'll ever make. The book fell from my hands as I processed what I'd just heard. $12 million. A 5-year contract. Keep me under control. Every conversation we'd had, every intimate moment we'd shared, every promise he'd made about our future together had been a performance with a very specific price tag. I sat frozen behind that gazebo for hours, watching James chat pleasantly with my parents over cocktails, seeing their relationship with completely new eyes. They weren't just approving of my fiancé, they'd hired him to be my warden. That night at dinner, I watched the three of them discuss our honeymoon plans with the detached interest of people planning a business trip. James suggested we spend a month at his family's compound in Martha's Vineyard, isolated from friends and family while I adjusted to married life. My father nodded approvingly, mentioning how important it was for me to settle into my new role quickly. My mother added that she'd spoken with James's mother about the best doctors for when we started having children, because babies help young wives focus on what's truly important. The conversation continued around me while I mechanically ate my dinner, feeling like a prisoner listening to guards discuss her cell arrangements. These people were planning to use marriage, pregnancy, and social isolation to ensure I never discovered the full extent of their criminal activities. I would be trapped in a web of legal and financial obligations, my reputation tied to James's, my children used as leverage to keep me compliant. The perfect life they'd always promised was actually an elaborate prison designed to protect their secrets. My growing awareness of their schemes expanded when I discovered James was already deeply involved in my parents' illegal activities. Documents in his briefcase, which I photographed when he left it unattended during a family dinner, showed his bank was facilitating the money laundering operation. The Wellington banking empire wasn't just benefiting from their association with my family, they were active participants in stealing millions of dollars from charitable donations meant for dying children. The scope of their cruelty became even clearer when I learned about their manipulation of my younger brother Alex. 3 years my junior, Alex had always been the family rebel, questioning our parents' decisions and supporting my dreams of independence. I thought he was my ally in the family dynamic, someone who understood how suffocating our upbringing had been. But during a particularly heated argument about my upcoming wedding, Alex revealed that our parents had been bribing him for years to spy on me and report my activities. They paid for his expensive sports car, his apartment in Manhattan, and his lifestyle in exchange for detailed reports about my friends, my conversations, and my state of mind. They needed to know if you were becoming a problem, Alex said with stunning casualness. You've always been too curious about things that aren't your business. They just wanted to make sure you weren't going to cause trouble for the family. The betrayal from my own brother, someone I'd protected and defended countless times over the years, left me feeling completely isolated. There was literally no one in my family I could trust, no relationship that wasn't contaminated by their need to control and manipulate me. The walls closed in further when our family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, who'd been a trusted advisor since I was a child, revealed his true loyalty during a pre-wedding legal consultation. Under the guise of explaining prenuptial agreements, he casually mentioned that he'd been monitoring my activities for my parents' peace of mind. Bank records, credit card statements, even my medical records were being regularly reviewed to ensure I wasn't developing any concerning behaviors. When I asked what he meant by concerning behaviors, he smiled paternally and explained that young women sometimes develop unrealistic ideas about independence that could damage family relationships. My first escape attempt happened 2 weeks before the wedding when the crushing reality of my situation finally overwhelmed my ability to pretend everything was normal. I packed a small suitcase, withdrew $5,000 from my personal account, and drove to the airport with plans to fly anywhere far from Connecticut. But when I tried to board a flight to California, I discovered my parents had frozen all my credit cards and bank accounts. Airport security detained me on their request, claiming I was having a mental health crisis and was a danger to myself. Sitting in that airport security office while my father drove 90 minutes to retrieve me was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. He arrived with Dr. Peterson, our family physician, who administered a sedative and declared me emotionally unstable due to pre-wedding stress. The ride home passed in a medicated haze while my father lectured me about responsibility, family loyalty, and the consequences of selfish behavior. "If you ever try something this foolish again," he said, his voice cold with menace, "we'll have no choice but to seek more permanent solutions for your mental health issues." The threat was crystal clear. Step out of line, and they'd have me committed to a psychiatric facility where I could disappear indefinitely. In their world, money could buy any diagnosis, any treatment, any outcome they desired. My temporary rebellion had only strengthened their resolve to control me more completely. It was during this lowest point that I met Sarah Martinez, a paralegal who worked for one of the law firms handling routine legal work for our family foundation. She came to our house to deliver documents and witnessed my parents berating me for wearing a dress they deemed inappropriate for a family dinner. After they left the room, Sarah quietly slipped me her business card and whispered, "If you ever need someone to talk to who understands how powerful families operate, call me." Something in her eyes told me she'd seen situations like mine before. Sarah Martinez became my lifeline to sanity and, eventually, to justice. Our first meeting took place at a small coffee shop 30 minutes from my family's estate, where Sarah revealed she'd been investigating charitable foundation fraud for the past 3 years. Her own sister had died from leukemia after their family donated their life savings to a foundation that turned out to be a front for wealthy individuals' tax evasion schemes. When she learned about the Carter Family Foundation's suspicious financial activities, she'd taken the job with our legal firm specifically to gather evidence. The scope of my parents' theft was staggering beyond anything I'd imagined. Over the past 8 years, the Carter Family Foundation had collected $43 million in donations from grieving families, corporate sponsors, and government grants, all supposedly dedicated to funding pediatric cancer research. Instead, less than $2 million had actually reached legitimate medical institutions. The remaining $41 million had been systematically stolen through a complex network of fake research companies, inflated administrative costs, and direct transfers to my parents' personal investment accounts. Sarah showed me bank statements, forged research reports, and testimonials from families who donated their children's college funds believing they were contributing to life-saving research. One letter, written by a mother whose 6-year-old daughter had died from brain cancer, described how she'd organized bake sales and car washes in her small town to raise $15,000 for the foundation. She'd specifically requested that her donation fund research into the rare type of cancer that killed her daughter, never knowing that her money had been used to purchase my mother's vacation home in the Hamptons. The criminal enterprise extended far beyond simple theft. My parents had created an entire ecosystem of fraud involving fake medical researchers, fabricated clinical trials, and elaborate reports designed to satisfy government oversight agencies. Dr. Marcus Brennan, listed as the Foundation's chief research coordinator, didn't exist. The prestigious medical facility supposedly conducting our funded research was actually a rented office space in Boston with no medical equipment or staff. The breakthrough treatments the Foundation claimed to have developed were plagiarized from legitimate research published years earlier by real medical institutions. What made the scheme particularly heinous was how my parents targeted the most vulnerable donors. They specifically solicited donations from families dealing with childhood cancer, exploiting their desperation and grief to extract maximum contributions. Foundation marketing materials featured photographs of children who had never consented to their images being used, some of whom had died while my parents were stealing money that could have funded their treatments. My parents' use of my identity in these crimes was extensive and sophisticated. Sarah showed me dozens of documents bearing my forged signature, including grant applications, research authorizations, and bank transfer approvals. They'd created an entire paper trail making me appear to be actively involved in the Foundation's operations, despite my complete ignorance of its criminal activities. If authorities investigated the Foundation, I would be among the first people arrested and charged with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The revelation that hit hardest was learning about my grandmother's manipulated will. Eleanor Carter, my father's mother, had been a genuinely compassionate woman who'd spent her later years volunteering at children's hospitals and supporting medical research. When she died 2 years earlier, I was devastated by the loss of the only family member who'd ever encouraged my independence. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched through her charitable work. Sarah had obtained a copy of my grandmother's original will, written 3 years before her death, which left me $50 million specifically designated for my education and independence. The will included a letter to me, written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting, expressing her hope that I would use the money to pursue my dreams and escape what she called the family's suffocating expectations. She'd seen through my parents' control and wanted to give me the financial freedom to build my own life. But the will that had been probated was completely different. In this version, my inheritance was reduced to a trust fund that wouldn't become accessible until I was 45 years old, and only if I remained married and had produced at least 2 children. The $50 million that should have been my ticket to freedom had been redirected to my parents, supposedly to be held in trust for my future children's education. My grandmother's heartfelt letter had been replaced with a generic note expressing confidence in my parents' judgment and encouraging me to follow their guidance in all life decisions. The document comparison Sarah conducted revealed clear evidence of forgery. The signatures didn't match, the paper was different quality, and the legal language was inconsistent with the rest of the document. My parents had stolen my inheritance and my grandmother's final gift of independence, replacing them with another tool of control and manipulation. When I confronted my parents about the foundation fraud and my grandmother's altered will, their response revealed the full extent of their callousness and criminal sophistication. My father didn't deny the charges. Instead, he calmly explained that successful families sometimes had to make difficult decisions to protect their interests. The cancer research donations were redirected toward more practical purposes, and my grandmother's will was updated to reflect a more mature understanding of family responsibilities. Their gaslighting reached new levels of psychological manipulation as they insisted my distress was evidence of mental instability rather than a reasonable response to discovering massive fraud. My mother scheduled appointments with Dr. Reynolds, a psychiatrist who'd been treating wealthy families for decades and had a reputation for diagnosing inconvenient relatives with various mental health conditions. During our sessions, Dr. Reynolds asked leading questions designed to establish a pattern of delusional thinking and emotional instability. Madison seems to be developing paranoid ideations about her family's business activities, Dr. Reynolds wrote in his report to my parents. She's exhibiting classic signs of pre-wedding anxiety combined with possible early-onset bipolar disorder. I recommend immediate intervention to prevent further deterioration of her mental state. The report, which I wasn't allowed to see until years later, recommended psychiatric hospitalization, medication, and possible long-term care if my delusional episodes continued. The psychiatric evaluation was the final piece of my parents' plan to neutralize me permanently. If I continued investigating their crimes or refusing to cooperate with their arrangements, they would have medical justification for committing me to a psychiatric facility. Once institutionalized, I could be medicated into compliance, isolated from potential allies, and legally declared incompetent to manage my own affairs. My parents would become my legal guardians, with complete control over my money, my medical treatment, and my future. Sarah helped me understand that my situation was more dangerous than I'd realized. My parents weren't just greedy criminals, they were sophisticated predators who'd spent years planning for every contingency. They had legal documents, medical reports, financial records, and professional recommendations all designed to support their narrative that I was mentally unstable and needed their protection. Fighting them would require more than just evidence of their crimes, it would require dismantling an entire system of corruption and manipulation they'd built around me. The discovery of my parents' pyramid scheme targeting elderly victims represented a new low in their criminal enterprise that I hadn't believed was possible. Sarah's investigation had uncovered what she called the Golden Years Investment Program, a sophisticated fraud operation that had been running parallel to the foundation theft for over 5 years. My parents had systematically targeted retirement communities, senior centers, and elderly churches throughout New England, promising guaranteed returns on investments that would secure their golden years forever. The program worked by exploiting elderly individuals' fears about outliving their retirement savings and their trust in successful, well-dressed professionals who spoke their language about traditional values and family security. My father would arrive at senior communities driving his luxury Mercedes, wearing expensive suits, and carrying briefcases full of impressive-looking financial projections. He presented himself as a successful businessman who developed an exclusive investment opportunity available only to select, worthy individuals who deserved better than the pathetic returns offered by traditional banking. The investment pitch was masterfully crafted psychological manipulation. My father would spend hours listening to elderly individuals describe their financial fears, their concern about becoming burdens on their children, and their desire to leave meaningful inheritances to their grandchildren. He'd then present his investment program as the solution to all their worries, promising annual returns of 20 to 30% with absolutely no risk to principal investments. Sarah showed me hundreds of contracts signed by victims ranging in age from 65 to 92, many of whom had invested their entire life savings based on my father's promises. Margaret Sullivan, an 87-year-old retired teacher, had invested her pension fund of $200,000 after my father convinced her she could double her money within 3 years. Robert Chen, a Korean War veteran, had mortgaged his home to invest $300,000, believing he was securing his wife's medical care for her advancing Alzheimer's disease. The scheme structure was designed to prevent victims from realizing they'd been defrauded until it was too late to recover their money. Initial investors received substantial returns for the first year, money that actually came from new victims rather than legitimate investments. These early profits were used as testimonials to recruit additional victims and encourage existing investors to contribute even more money. By the time victims realized no real investments existed, their money had been transferred through multiple offshore accounts and was essentially unrecoverable. What made the scheme particularly cruel was how my parents selected their targets. They specifically sought elderly individuals who were socially isolated, cognitively vulnerable, or dealing with medical crises that made them desperate for financial security. They avoided targeting individuals with financially savvy adult children or those connected to tight-knit communities that might question suspicious investment opportunities. Their victims were carefully chosen to be the least likely to seek help or be believed if they complained. The human cost of their crimes was devastating. Sarah had interviewed dozens of victims whose lives had been destroyed by trusting my parents. Eleanor Washington, a 73-year-old widow, had been forced to move from her family home into subsidized housing after losing her deceased husband's insurance money. She now survived on food stamps and charity, constantly apologizing to her children for squandering their inheritance on what she called my foolish greed. James Patterson, an 80-year-old retired police officer, had suffered a heart attack when he discovered his investment had disappeared. His family blamed his death on the stress and betrayal of losing his life savings to criminals he'd trusted completely. His widow was pursuing a wrongful death lawsuit, but my parents' lawyers were fighting the claims using technicalities and statute of limitations arguments designed to exhaust the family's resources. The discovery that truly shattered my remaining faith in my family came when I learned that my younger brother Alex wasn't just spying on me for money, he was actively participating in the elderly fraud scheme. Alex had been trained to pose as a financial advisor specializing in family legacy planning, targeting victims through online dating sites and social media platforms where lonely seniors searched for companionship and advice. Alex's role was particularly insidious because he used his youth and charm to gain victims' trust before introducing them to my father's investment program. He'd spend weeks building emotional relationships with elderly women, convincing them he cared about their financial welfare and wanted to help them achieve security and independence. Once he'd established trust, he'd casually mention my father's incredible investment program and offer to arrange a personal meeting. Sarah showed me transcripts of phone calls between Alex and his victims, recordings that had been preserved as evidence for potential prosecution. In one call, Alex spent 40 minutes consoling 82-year-old Dorothy Martinez about her late husband's medical bills before suggesting she could honor his memory by investing wisely and leaving a substantial inheritance for their grandchildren. His voice was gentle, caring, and completely convincing as he guided her toward financial ruin. The betrayal from Alex hurt worse than my parents' crimes because I genuinely believed he was different from them. We'd spent countless hours discussing our family's problems, and he'd seemed to share my concerns about their controlling behavior and questionable ethics. Learning that every conversation had been an opportunity for him to gather information while planning my destruction felt like losing the last piece of my identity as a person who mattered to anyone. The psychiatric hospitalization threat became immediate when my parents realized I'd discovered the elderly fraud scheme. My confrontation with Alex about his participation had been overheard by my mother, who immediately called Dr. Reynolds to report that I was having a severe psychotic episode characterized by paranoid accusations against family members. Within hours, she'd arranged for an ambulance to transport me to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital for emergency evaluation and treatment. The institutional commitment process revealed how thoroughly my parents had prepared for this eventuality. Dr. Reynolds had been documenting my supposed mental health decline for months, creating a medical history that supported involuntary commitment. My mother provided detailed testimony about my increasingly erratic behavior, including my broken engagement attempts, my delusional accusations about family business practices, and my dangerous obsession with legal matters beyond my understanding. The commitment hearing lasted less than 20 minutes, during which my parents presented themselves as loving family members desperately seeking help for their troubled daughter. My attempts to explain their criminal activities were dismissed as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. The judge, who later turned out to have received substantial donations to his campaign from my father, signed the commitment order without seriously considering my testimony or requesting independent psychiatric evaluation. Sarah tried to prevent my hospitalization by contacting legal aid organizations and patient advocacy groups, but my parents' resources and connections proved too powerful to overcome quickly. By the time she'd assembled a legal team willing to challenge the commitment, I'd already been transported to Riverside Psychiatric Hospital and placed under Dr. Reynolds' direct care. The hospital was a private facility that specialized in treating wealthy families' problematic relatives, with a reputation for discretion, compliance, and successful attitude adjustments that helped difficult family members accept their proper roles. The staff was trained to view patients' protests about their treatment as symptoms of their underlying mental illness rather than legitimate complaints about rights violations. My first week at Riverside was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to break my resistance to my parents' control. Dr. Reynolds prescribed a combination of antipsychotic and mood-stabilizing medications that left me drowsy, confused, and unable to think clearly about my situation. When I refused to take the medications voluntarily, orderlies held me down while nurses administered injections that left me unconscious for hours at a time. The treatment plan Dr. Reynolds developed was explicitly designed to make me grateful for my parents' guidance and eager to return to their supervision. Individual therapy sessions focused on helping me recognize my unrealistic expectations about independence and develop appropriate appreciation for my family's love and support. Group therapy sessions were conducted with other patients who'd been successfully convinced that their family's control was actually carrying protection from their own poor judgment. Riverside Psychiatric Hospital felt like a luxurious prison designed to break wealthy patients' spirits while maintaining the appearance of providing excellent medical care. The facility was gorgeous, with manicured gardens, expensive artwork, and private rooms that looked more like high-end hotel suites than medical facilities. But beneath the elegant facade was a systematic program of psychological manipulation and chemical control that turned patients into compliant shadows of their former selves. Dr. Reynolds' treatment plan for me was based on a simple premise: my resistance to my family's arrangements stemmed from grandiose delusions about my capabilities and paranoid fantasies about their motives. Every attempt I made to discuss their criminal activities was documented as evidence of my deteriorating grasp on reality. When I mentioned the foundation fraud, he noted persistent delusional beliefs about charitable conspiracies. When I described the elderly investment scheme, he wrote elaborate paranoid fantasies involving family members. The medication regimen was carefully calibrated to keep me functional enough to participate in therapy sessions while preventing me from thinking clearly enough to mount effective resistance. The antipsychotic drugs caused constant drowsiness, making it difficult to concentrate or remember details about my parents' crimes. The mood stabilizers eliminated my emotional responses to injustice, leaving me feeling disconnected from my own experiences and unable to maintain anger about their betrayals. But I discovered that some medications could be hidden under my tongue and spat out later, allowing me to maintain periods of mental clarity when the staff believed I was fully medicated. During these lucid intervals, I began observing the hospital's operations and connecting with other patients who'd maintained some awareness of their situations. The patient population at Riverside included dozens of individuals whose families had used psychiatric hospitalization to solve inheritance disputes, business conflicts, and social embarrassments. Margaret Whitmore, a 70-year-old woman in the room next to mine, had been committed by her adult children when she'd threatened to change her will to leave money to animal charities instead of funding their expensive lifestyles. She'd been at Riverside for 8 months, heavily medicated and convinced by Dr. Reynolds that her desire to help animals was evidence of late-onset mental illness. Thomas Bradley, a 45-year-old man who'd discovered his father was embezzling from their family business, had been hospitalized when he'd threatened to contact federal investigators. He'd been at Riverside for 2 years, undergoing treatment for what Dr. Reynolds diagnosed as business-related paranoid disorder. Thomas had learned to pretend the medications were working while secretly maintaining his sanity and gathering evidence about the hospital's practices. Patricia Hendricks, a 60-year-old woman who'd tried to report her husband's sexual abuse of their granddaughter, had been committed for false memory syndrome and vindictive personality disorder. She'd been at Riverside for 6 months, but had managed to contact Child Protective Services through a sympathetic orderly who'd helped smuggle out her letters. Her case was under investigation, but her husband's political connections were slowing the process. These conversations, conducted in whispers during supervised recreational activities, revealed that Riverside was essentially a private prison for wealthy individuals whose families needed them silenced or controlled. Dr. Reynolds and his staff were being paid enormous fees to provide medical justification for what amounted to kidnapping and false imprisonment. The hospital's licensing and accreditation were maintained through carefully falsified records and substantial donations to regulatory agencies. The most chilling discovery was learning about patients who died at Riverside under suspicious circumstances. Thomas told me about Janet Morrison, a 52-year-old woman who'd threatened to expose her family's tax evasion schemes. She'd been found dead in her room 6 months after admission, supposedly from a heart attack caused by her psychiatric medications. Her family had cremated her body immediately and donated a new wing to the hospital in her memory. Another patient, David Carpenter, had died from what Dr. Reynolds called accidental medication overdose after he'd managed to contact a newspaper reporter about his family's insurance fraud. The overdose occurred the night before he was scheduled to be interviewed by investigators. His death was ruled accidental, but several patients reported seeing orderlies entering his room multiple times during the night shift. These weren't accidents or suicide, they were murders designed to protect wealthy families from exposure by inconvenient relatives. Riverside Psychiatric Hospital was a killing field disguised as a medical facility, and my parents had delivered me directly into the hands of people who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate me permanently if I became too much trouble. The knowledge that my life was in immediate danger motivated me to begin planning an escape with the help of Thomas and Margaret, who'd been developing their own plans for months. We discovered that the hospital's security was designed to prevent patients from leaving but wasn't prepared for organized resistance from multiple individuals working together. The orderly Patricia had been communicating with a man named Carlos who'd grown disgusted with the hospital's practices, agreed to help coordinate our escape attempt. Carlos revealed that several staff members were uncomfortable with Dr. Reynolds' methods but were afraid to speak out because of threats to their employment and immigration status. He'd been documenting abuses for months, hoping to find someone with enough credibility and resources to bring down the entire operation. Our escape plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple people, both inside and outside the hospital. Sarah had been working with FBI agents who were investigating foundation fraud, and they'd developed suspicions about Riverside based on similar cases in other states. Carlos would provide us with security codes and distraction opportunities, while Sarah would have vehicles waiting at predetermined locations. The plan nearly fell apart when Nurse Patricia Morrison, who'd been reporting patients' conversations to Dr. Reynolds for years, overheard Thomas and me discussing escape routes during what we thought was a private moment in the garden. She immediately reported our conversation, leading to increased surveillance and the decision to transfer me to a maximum security psychiatric facility in upstate New York. The transfer was scheduled for 3 days later, giving us a narrow window to implement our escape plan before I disappeared into an even more secure prison. Dr. Reynolds informed my parents that my condition was deteriorating rapidly and that I required intensive long-term treatment in a specialized facility designed for dangerous patients. The new facility had a reputation for keeping patients indefinitely, with no outside contact or possibility of appeal. The night before my scheduled transfer, Carlos provided us with security codes and a detailed layout of the hospital's surveillance systems. The escape would happen during the night shift change, when staffing was minimal and security cameras were being reset for routine maintenance. Margaret and Thomas would create a distraction in the common area while I made my way to the roof access, where Sarah would be waiting with a helicopter that could land on the hospital's helipad. The escape itself was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Margaret and Thomas started a loud argument about card game rules that attracted the attention of night shift orderlies, while I slipped out of my room and made my way through service corridors to the roof access stairs. Carlos had disabled the alarms on the roof access door, allowing me to reach the helipad without triggering security alerts. Sarah was waiting with the helicopter, piloted by an ex-military friend who specialized in medical evacuations and asked no questions about the circumstances. As we lifted off from the hospital roof, I could see security guards running across the grounds below, their flashlights searching frantically for escaped patients they'd never find. The helicopter flew to a small private airport in Massachusetts, where Sarah had arranged for a charter flight to take us to a safe location while she implemented the next phase of our plan. But as we approached the landing strip, we could see police cars surrounding the airport, their red and blue lights flashing in the darkness. My parents had anticipated our escape and had law enforcement agencies searching for their dangerously mentally ill daughter who'd been kidnapped by criminals posing as patient advocates. We couldn't land at the airport without being captured and returned to Riverside, or possibly to an even worse facility. The helicopter pilot made a split-second decision to fly to an abandoned airstrip he knew from his military days, landing in a remote area where Sarah's FBI contacts could meet us without involving local law enforcement agencies that might be influenced by my parents' money and connections. As we touched down on the overgrown runway, I realized this was just the beginning of a much more dangerous game than I'd ever imagined. Living underground felt like stepping into a parallel world where wealthy families' victims found each other and developed survival strategies that law enforcement agencies couldn't or wouldn't provide. Sarah had connected with a network of individuals who'd escaped from situations similar to mine, people whose families had used psychiatric hospitalization, legal manipulation, and financial abuse to silence them. This underground community operated like a modern witness protection program, helping victims disappear while building cases against their abusers. The safe house where I spent my first week of freedom was a modest apartment in Springfield, Massachusetts, owned by Janet Rodriguez, a former psychiatric nurse who'd quit her job after witnessing too many questionable commitments of inconvenient family members. Janet had been helping abuse victims for 5 years, providing temporary shelter while they gathered evidence and developed long-term safety plans. Her apartment was equipped with sophisticated security systems and communication equipment that allowed residents to coordinate with legal advocates and federal investigators. During my first few days of freedom, I met other survivors whose stories revealed the scope of institutionalized family abuse among wealthy Americans. Rebecca Thompson had been committed by her husband when she'd discovered he was molesting their teenage daughter. She'd spent 18 months at a facility similar to Riverside before escaping with the help of a sympathetic attorney who'd smuggled out her testimony. Her case had resulted in her husband's conviction, but only after she'd lived underground for 2 years while federal investigators built their case. Michael Zhang had been hospitalized by his business partners when he'd threatened to report their embezzlement from their technology company. His commitment had been based on claims that his stress over business failures had triggered a psychotic breakdown requiring intensive treatment. He'd escaped after 6 months and had been living underground for 3 years, working with federal investigators to build cases against corrupt psychiatric facilities and the families who used them as private prisons. Lisa Martinez, no relation to Sarah, had been committed by her parents when she'd tried to report their involvement in human trafficking operations. Her family owned a chain of restaurants that were actually fronts for bringing undocumented workers into the country and forcing them into slave labor conditions. She'd spent 2 years underground, gathering evidence and working with immigration authorities to shut down their operations. These conversations revealed that my family's crimes were part of a much larger pattern of wealthy individuals using psychiatric hospitalization to silence inconvenient relatives. The network had documented hundreds of cases across the country, involving families who controlled billions of dollars in assets and had corrupted multiple institutions to protect their interests. The most shocking discovery was learning that my parents had been actively hunting me with resources that went far beyond typical private investigators. Sarah showed me evidence that they'd hired Blackwater-style mercenaries who specialized in locating and retrieving problem family members for wealthy clients. These operatives had military training, international connections, and access to surveillance technology that could track individuals across multiple countries. My parents' manhunt was being coordinated by Harrison Security Services, a company that advertised discreet family reunification services for clients whose relatives had been manipulated by hostile parties into abandoning their families. Harrison's operatives had been following Sarah's movements for weeks, tracking her through her credit card transactions, cell phone usage, and professional contacts. They'd nearly captured me twice during my first week underground, missing me by minutes when they raided safe houses I'd recently left. The realization that professional killers were hunting me forced a fundamental shift in how I thought about my situation. This wasn't just a family dispute that could be resolved through legal channels. It was a war between people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints against individuals whose only weapons were truth and determination. My parents weren't just trying to control me, they were trying to eliminate a threat to their empire. Rachel Morrison, who I'd trusted as a childhood friend, turned out to be another source of betrayal that nearly cost me my life. Rachel had been feeding information about my location and activities to my parents since my escape from Riverside. She'd convinced Sarah that she wanted to help, offering to provide shelter and transportation while secretly reporting our every move to Harrison Security Services. The trap Rachel set was sophisticated and nearly perfect. She arranged to meet me at a secluded restaurant where she claimed to have information about other victims of my parents' schemes. The meeting location was chosen specifically because it had multiple exit routes for Harrison operatives while providing only one escape route for me. Rachel's emotional performance was convincing, complete with tears and apologies for not helping me sooner. Only a last-minute warning from Carlos, who'd been monitoring Harrison Security's communications, prevented me from walking into certain capture or death. Carlos had traced Rachel's phone calls and discovered her connection to Harrison, calling Sarah just minutes before I entered the restaurant. I escaped through the kitchen while Rachel sat at our table, checking her watch and texting updates to the operatives positioned outside. The betrayal from Rachel hurt almost as much as my family's crimes because she'd been part of my emotional support system during the darkest periods of my imprisonment. We'd shared secrets about my fears and dreams, conversations I'd believed were helping me process trauma and develop resilience. Learning that every word had been reported to people planning to destroy me felt like losing another piece of my identity as someone capable of judging character or building meaningful relationships. But the underground network provided something my privileged upbringing never had. Genuine relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice rather than wealth and status. Sarah, Janet, Carlos, and the other survivors became the family I'd never had, people who cared about my well-being because of who I was rather than what I could provide for them. Working with federal investigators became my full-time occupation during the months I lived underground. Agent Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in white-collar crime involving charitable foundations, had been building a case against organizations like my parents' foundation for years. She'd documented patterns of fraud across multiple states but had struggled to find witnesses willing to testify against wealthy families with resources to retaliate. Agent David Kim, who investigated psychiatric hospital abuses, had been trying to build cases against facilities like Riverside for years but had been blocked by medical privacy laws and institutional resistance. My testimony, combined with evidence from other underground network members, provided the breakthrough he needed to obtain search warrants and subpoena medical records. The evidence-gathering process was extensive and dangerous, requiring us to maintain surveillance on my parents' operations while avoiding capture by Harrison security operatives. We documented money transfers, recorded phone conversations, photographed falsified documents, and interviewed dozens of victims whose lives had been destroyed by my family's crimes. Sarah's legal skills proved invaluable during this process, as she knew how to preserve evidence in ways that would be admissible in federal court and how to coordinate with multiple law enforcement agencies without creating jurisdictional conflicts. Her experience with foundation fraud cases provided blueprints for investigating my parents' charitable schemes, while her connections in the legal community helped us find attorneys willing to represent victims despite the risks involved. The network's security protocols became more sophisticated as Harrison Security escalated their efforts to locate me. We used encrypted communications, changed safe houses weekly, and employed counter-surveillance techniques to detect when we were being followed. Several times, we had to abandon planned meetings or evidence-gathering operations when we detected Harrison operatives in the area. The most dangerous moment came when Harrison security operatives attempted to kidnap Sarah, believing they could use her as leverage to force me to surrender. They grabbed her as she left a legal aid office in Boston, but she managed to trigger a panic alarm that brought police to the scene. The kidnappers escaped, but the incident prompted federal investigators to provide official protection for key witnesses and advocates. During my months underground, I transformed from a sheltered victim into a skilled investigator and survivor. I learned surveillance techniques, self-defense, legal research, and strategic thinking that my privileged education had never provided. More importantly, I developed the emotional strength and moral clarity that came from fighting for something bigger than my own freedom. The underground network wasn't just helping individual victims escape abusive families. We were building a systematic campaign to expose and destroy the institutional corruption that enabled wealthy criminals to operate with impunity. Our goal wasn't just justice for individual cases but fundamental reform of the systems that allowed psychiatric hospitals, legal institutions, and law enforcement agencies to be purchased by criminal families. Filing the initial lawsuit against my parents felt like firing the first shot in a war I'd been forced to fight for my survival. Sarah had assembled a legal team that included federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and specialists in white-collar crime who understood the scope of institutional corruption we were challenging. The lawsuit wasn't just about recovering stolen money, it was about dismantling an entire criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. The legal documents we filed painted a comprehensive picture of my parents' crimes, including detailed evidence of foundation fraud, elderly financial abuse, psychiatric hospital corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. Each charge was supported by hundreds of pages of documentation, recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from multiple victims. The case was so extensive that it required a specialized federal task force to coordinate the investigation and prosecution. My parents' reaction to being served with federal lawsuit papers was immediate and vicious. Within hours, they'd contacted every major media outlet in New England to announce that their mentally ill daughter had been brainwashed by criminals and was making false accusations as part of an elaborate extortion scheme. They presented themselves as heartbroken parents whose only crime was trying to protect their unstable child from people who were exploiting her condition. The media campaign they launched was professionally orchestrated character assassination designed to destroy my credibility before I could testify publicly about their crimes. They hired a public relations firm that specialized in crisis management for wealthy families facing scandals, creating a narrative that portrayed me as an ungrateful daughter who'd suffered a mental breakdown and was being manipulated by opportunistic lawyers seeking a payday from innocent victims. Dr. Reynolds provided detailed psychiatric reports claiming that my accusations against my family were textbook examples of paranoid delusion disorders often seen in patients who'd refused proper treatment. He explained to reporters that my escape from Riverside represented a dangerous escalation of my condition that required immediate intervention to protect both me and the family members I was threatening. James Wellington appeared on television interviews expressing his heartbreak at watching the woman he'd loved deteriorate into someone who could make such cruel accusations against the people who'd dedicated their lives to caring for her. He described our relationship as a fairy tale romance destroyed by my inability to accept help for my mental health issues, presenting himself as a devoted fiancé who still hoped I'd recover and remember the love we'd shared. The media blitz was sophisticated and effective, generating sympathy for my parents while casting doubt on my mental stability and moral character. Editorial columnists wrote about the tragedy of mental illness and the importance of trusting medical professionals over patients' self-reporting. Social media campaigns portrayed me as an example of how untreated psychiatric conditions could turn loving family relationships into sources of paranoid persecution fantasies. But my parents had underestimated the evidence we'd gathered and the determination of federal investigators who'd been waiting years for an opportunity to prosecute cases like theirs. Agent Walsh held a press conference revealing that my accusations were part of a federal investigation involving multiple criminal organizations and corrupt institutions. She presented bank records, recorded conversations, and testimony from other victims that corroborated every aspect of my claims. The evidence was so overwhelming that several major news organizations began investigating my parents' background instead of simply reporting their denials. Investigative journalists discovered inconsistencies in their charitable foundation's financial reports, suspicious patterns in their business transactions, and connections to other families facing similar accusations from their children. My uncle Robert Carter, my father's younger brother, joined their character assassination campaign with particularly vicious personal attacks designed to destroy my relationship with extended family members who might have supported me. Robert appeared on television claiming that I'd always been a troubled child who'd shown signs of mental illness from an early age, describing supposed incidents of lying, stealing, and violent behavior that had never happened. Robert's betrayal was especially painful because he'd been present during my childhood and knew that his accusations were complete fabrications. But his lies served my parents' narrative by providing supposedly independent confirmation of my alleged mental health problems from a family member who'd witnessed my behavior over many years. The most dangerous escalation in my parents' retaliation came when they hired professional operatives to eliminate me permanently while making my death appear to be suicide caused by mental illness. Harrison Security Services had been replaced by an even more sinister organization called Family Resolution Associates, which specialized in final solutions for wealthy clients whose problematic relatives couldn't be controlled through conventional means. The assassination attempt happened during a carefully planned ambush outside a legal aid office in Hartford, Connecticut, where I was scheduled to meet with federal prosecutors. 3 operatives positioned themselves around the building while a 4th posed as a delivery driver to get close enough for what was supposed to look like a random street crime that escalated into fatal violence. Only the intervention of FBI protective detail agents prevented the assassination from succeeding. Agent Kim's team had been monitoring Family Resolution Associates' communications and had detected the planned attack, positioning themselves to intercept the operatives before they could complete their mission. The gun battle that ensued left 2 operatives dead and 1 captured, while I escaped physically unharmed but emotionally shattered by the realization that my parents were willing to have me murdered. The captured operative, Marcus Thompson, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for protection from the criminal organization that had recruited him. His testimony revealed that Family Resolution Associates had been hired to eliminate dozens of inconvenient family members over the past decade, making their deaths appear to be accidents, suicides, or random crimes. My parents had paid $500,000 for my assassination, with specific instructions to make it appear that I'd killed myself due to overwhelming guilt about making false accusations against my loving family. Thompson's cooperation provided federal investigators with evidence of a systematic murder-for-hire operation that targeted family members who threatened wealthy criminals' interests. His testimony implicated dozens of wealthy families across multiple states and revealed connections between corrupt psychiatric hospitals, legal professionals, and assassination services that operated like a criminal franchise protecting family wealth. The assassination attempt marked a turning point in public perception of my case and my parents' character. Media outlets that had initially portrayed them sympathetically began investigating their connections to family resolution associates and questioning whether loving parents would hire assassins to kill their mentally ill daughter. The attempted murder provided concrete evidence that my accusations about their criminal nature were accurate rather than delusional. Sarah's legal strategy shifted from defensive to offensive as federal prosecutors began treating my parents as heads of a criminal organization rather than victims of false accusations. The assassination attempt provided grounds for additional charges including conspiracy to commit murder, witness intimidation, and racketeering under federal organized crime statutes. My parents' legal team, which had initially focused on portraying them as innocent victims, was forced to shift toward damage control and plea bargain negotiations as evidence of their crimes became undeniable. Their high-powered attorneys began floating potential deals that would involve cooperation with federal investigations in exchange for reduced sentences, but prosecutors were committed to pursuing maximum penalties given the scope and cruelty of their criminal enterprise. The first major victory came when federal judges granted restraining orders preventing my parents from accessing the foundation's remaining assets or contacting any of their elderly fraud victims. The orders effectively froze their criminal operations while investigators worked to trace stolen money and identify additional victims who might be entitled to restitution. The federal case against my parents grew into one of the largest white-collar crime prosecutions in New England's history, involving over 300 victims, $43 million in documented theft, and evidence of systematic murder conspiracies spanning multiple decades. Agent Walsh assembled a task force of specialists from the FBI, IRS, SEC, and state attorney general offices to coordinate the investigation and prosecution of what prosecutors called the Carter criminal enterprise. The evidence we'd gathered during my months underground provided the foundation for subpoenas and search warrants that uncovered thousands of additional documents hidden in offshore accounts, safety deposit boxes, and encrypted computer files. My parents had maintained detailed records of their criminal activities, apparently confident that their wealth and connections would protect them from ever facing consequences for their actions. The foundation fraud documentation filled 17 bankers' boxes with contracts, bank records, forged research reports, and correspondence with victims who'd been systematically deceived and robbed. Each transaction had been carefully recorded, creating a paper trail that made prosecution relatively straightforward once investigators gained access to my parents' files. The elderly investment scheme evidence revealed a sophisticated criminal organization that had operated in 12 states over 8 years, targeting over 400 senior citizens and stealing more than $60 million in retirement savings. The scheme had employed dozens of accomplices, including fake financial advisors, corrupt bank officials, and professional marketers who specialized in elderly fraud. Dr. Reynolds and Riverside Psychiatric Hospital became the subject of a separate federal investigation that uncovered evidence of systematic patient abuse, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Federal agents discovered that Riverside had been operating as a private prison for wealthy families for over 15 years, generating millions of dollars in revenue from families who needed inconvenient relatives silenced or eliminated. The hospital's patient records revealed dozens of suspicious deaths that had been attributed to medical complications but showed clear patterns suggesting systematic murder. Federal forensic accountants traced payments from wealthy families to Riverside that coincided with patients' deaths, creating evidence of a murder-for-hire operation disguised as psychiatric treatment. My Aunt Susan's attempted poisoning, which I'd survived because Sarah had trained me to be suspicious of any food or drink that hadn't been prepared by trusted allies, provided additional evidence of my family's willingness to commit murder to protect their interests. Susan had used ricin, a sophisticated poison that would have caused a death resembling natural illness if administered in proper doses. Federal investigators traced the ricin to a chemical supply company that had been providing poisons to Family Resolution Associates and other organizations that specialized in untraceable assassinations. Susan's purchase of the ricin had been recorded in company files that were seized during raids on the assassination service network, providing clear evidence of premeditated attempted murder. The revelation that I wasn't actually adopted, despite my parents' claims in their final desperate gambit, came from DNA testing that proved Richard and Helen Carter were indeed my biological parents. Their claim that I was an adopted child with unknown genetic mental health issues was designed to support their narrative about my supposed psychiatric instability while providing them with psychological distance from responsibility for my accusations. But the DNA tests not only confirmed our biological relationship, they also revealed that I was the daughter they'd always presented me as being, with full legal rights to inheritance and family assets. Their adoption lie had backfired by drawing attention to their other lies and demonstrating their willingness to fabricate any story that might protect their interests. The media attention surrounding the case attracted additional victims who came forward with their own stories of being abused, defrauded, or threatened by my parents and their associates. Newspaper investigations revealed that the Carter criminal enterprise had been operating for over 20 years, evolving from simple tax evasion into sophisticated schemes involving charitable fraud, elderly abuse, and systematic elimination of threats to their operations. Former employees of my parents' businesses provided testimony about being forced to participate in fraudulent schemes or face termination and blacklisting within their industries. Several employees revealed that they'd witnessed evidence of criminal activities but had been too frightened to report them because of my parents' reputation for destroying people who opposed their interests. The scope of institutional corruption became clear as federal investigators discovered that my parents had been paying bribes to law enforcement officials, judges, medical professionals, and regulatory agency employees for years. Their criminal enterprise had succeeded by systematically corrupting the institutions that were supposed to protect victims and enforce laws. Judge Harrison Matthews, who'd signed my psychiatric commitment order, was arrested for accepting bribes from multiple wealthy families in exchange for rubber-stamping involuntary commitment papers without proper legal review. His corruption had enabled dozens of families to imprison inconvenient relatives in psychiatric facilities, generating millions of dollars in illegal revenue while destroying countless lives. Dr. Reynolds faced separate federal charges for his role in the psychiatric hospital murder conspiracy, with evidence showing he'd received over $2 million in payments for eliminating problematic patients through medication overdoses, induced heart attacks, and other methods designed to appear like natural deaths or medical accidents. Multiple federal agencies joined the prosecution as evidence revealed connections between the Carter criminal enterprise and other criminal organizations operating throughout the country. What had started as a case about foundation fraud had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of systematic corruption involving hundreds of wealthy families and thousands of victims. The investigation expanded internationally as federal agents traced money laundering operations through banks in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and other jurisdictions known for protecting criminal assets. My parents had been moving stolen money through sophisticated financial networks that required cooperation from multiple countries to trace and recover. Former business partners began fleeing the country as they realized the scope of the federal investigation and their own exposure to criminal charges. Several attempted to negotiate immunity deals in exchange for testimony against my parents, but prosecutors were demanding full cooperation and asset forfeiture before considering any plea agreements. The evidence mountain grew to include over 50,000 documents, hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, testimonies from more than 200 victims, and financial records spanning 2 decades of criminal activity. Federal prosecutors described it as one of the most comprehensive white-collar crime cases in American legal history. As the trial date approached, my parents' legal team made increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate plea bargains that would allow them to avoid life sentences. But federal prosecutors, supported by overwhelming evidence and pressure from hundreds of victims, refused to accept any deals that didn't include full admission of guilt, complete asset forfeiture, and maximum prison sentences. The courtroom was packed with victims, media representatives, and law enforcement officials when I finally had the opportunity to confront my parents and tell the truth about their criminal empire. Federal prosecutors had built such a comprehensive case that my testimony was almost unnecessary for securing convictions, but I insisted on speaking because hundreds of victims deserved to see their abusers held accountable for the suffering they'd caused. Walking into that federal courthouse, seeing my parents sitting at the defense table in orange jumpsuits and shackles, felt like stepping out of a nightmare into the clear light of justice. They rolled their eyes when they saw me approaching the witness stand, their final gesture of contempt for the daughter they'd tried to control, silence, and ultimately eliminate. But when I began speaking, their arrogance transformed into visible fear as they realized the scope of evidence I was presenting. Judge Patricia Williams, a respected federal judge with 30 years of experience prosecuting organized crime, listened with obvious shock as I detailed the systematic nature of my parents' criminal enterprise. Her expression grew increasingly grim as I described the foundation fraud that had stolen money from families whose children were dying of cancer, the elderly investment schemes that had destroyed hundreds of retirement savings accounts, and the psychiatric hospital conspiracy that had murdered inconvenient family members. The moment that defined the entire trial came when I presented audio recordings of my parents discussing their plans to have me assassinated. The courtroom fell completely silent as their voices filled the air, calmly discussing whether to make my death appear to be suicide or an accident, and calculating how much they were willing to pay to eliminate their problem daughter permanently. My father's voice on the recording was particularly chilling. "Madison has become too dangerous to control through conventional methods. The Foundation investigation could destroy everything we've built if she continues cooperating with federal agents. We need a permanent solution that eliminates the threat while generating sympathy for our family." My mother's response was equally cold. "Family Resolution Associates guarantees their work will appear natural. For $500,000, we can end this problem and claim we're grieving parents whose disturbed daughter finally succumbed to her mental illness." Judge Williams stopped the recording and asked for a recess, apparently needing time to process the fact that parents had been captured on tape planning their daughter's murder while discussing it like a routine business transaction. When court resumed, she addressed my parents directly. "In 30 years on this bench, I have never encountered defendants who demonstrated such calculated cruelty toward their own child while showing such callous disregard for the lives of hundreds of other victims." The prosecution's presentation of evidence took 3 weeks, during which jury members visibly struggled to comprehend the scope of my parents' criminal enterprise. Financial experts explained how they'd stolen $43 million from the Children's Cancer Foundation while spending the money on luxury vacations, expensive jewelry, and real estate investments. Elder abuse specialists described how they'd targeted the most vulnerable senior citizens, exploiting their loneliness and medical fears to steal their life savings. Medical experts testified about the psychiatric hospital murder conspiracy, explaining how Dr. Reynolds had systematically killed patients whose families wanted them eliminated while making their deaths appear to be medical complications. FBI agents presented evidence of the assassination attempts against me and other family members who'd threatened to expose criminal activities. The defense team's attempts to portray my parents as loving family members who'd been misunderstood and falsely accused collapsed under the weight of recorded conversations, financial documents, and testimony from dozens of victims. Their lawyers eventually abandoned any pretense of innocence and focused on pleading for mercy based on their clients' ages and supposed remorse for their actions. But my parents showed no genuine remorse throughout the trial, maintaining their arrogant belief that their wealth and status should protect them from consequences. During sentencing hearings, they continued to portray themselves as victims of a conspiracy involving their mentally ill daughter and overzealous federal prosecutors who were jealous of their success. The jury's guilty verdicts on all 97 federal charges took less than 4 hours to reach, with jurors later explaining that the evidence was so overwhelming they'd spent most of their deliberation time trying to comprehend how such extensive criminal activity had continued for so long without being stopped by law enforcement agencies. Judge Williams sentenced my father to life in federal prison without possibility of parole, describing his crimes as a systematic campaign of theft, fraud, and murder that demonstrated complete disregard for human life and suffering. My mother received the same sentence, with the judge noting that her participation in planning my assassination made her equally culpable for the enterprise's most serious crimes. Dr. Reynolds was sentenced to death for his role in murdering psychiatric hospital patients, making him one of the few medical professionals in American history to receive capital punishment for systematic patient killing. Riverside Psychiatric Hospital was permanently closed, and its assets were seized to provide restitution for victims' families. The financial recovery process resulted in the largest victim restitution fund in federal court history, with over $100 million recovered from offshore accounts, real estate sales, and asset forfeitures. Every family who donated to the Fraudulent Cancer Foundation received full reimbursement plus interest, while elderly fraud victims recovered most of their stolen retirement savings. My inheritance, which had been stolen through my grandmother's forged will, was fully restored along with additional damages totaling $75 million. But more important than the money was the legal precedent the case established for prosecuting wealthy families who use institutional corruption to silence victims and escape consequences for their crimes. I used part of my recovered inheritance to establish the Carter Foundation for Family Abuse Survivors, a legitimate charitable organization dedicated to helping victims of financial abuse, psychiatric imprisonment, and family violence. The foundation provides legal assistance, safe housing, and financial support for individuals trapped in situations similar to what I'd experienced. The underground network that had saved my life became a formal organization with federal funding and legal recognition, expanding its operations to help family abuse victims throughout the country. Sarah became the organization's legal director, while Janet, Carlos, and other survivors became advocates and counselors for new victims seeking help. The case inspired legislative reforms that strengthened oversight of psychiatric hospitals, charitable foundations, and elder care facilities. Congress passed new laws requiring independent review of all involuntary psychiatric commitments and creating federal penalties for families who abuse commitment processes to silence relatives. 5 years after the trial, I'd built a life dedicated to helping other victims while maintaining the relationships that sustained me through the darkest period of my existence. Sarah and I remain close friends and professional collaborators, working together to expose family abuse and institutional corruption. The underground network survivors have become my chosen family, people who understand the journey from victimhood to empowerment. The bittersweet reality is that justice doesn't erase the trauma of discovering that the people who were supposed to love and protect me were willing to murder me to protect their criminal enterprise. I'll never have the loving family relationships that most people take for granted, and the scars from years of manipulation and betrayal will never completely heal. But I've learned that breaking cycles of abuse requires more than just escaping from dangerous situations. It requires building new systems that protect vulnerable people from institutional corruption and family violence. The courage to speak truth to power, even when that power belongs to your own parents, becomes a gift you give to everyone who comes after you. The most important lesson I want to share is that wealth and status don't protect children from abuse, they often just make the abuse more sophisticated and harder to escape. If you suspect someone you know is being abused by their family, don't assume their privilege means they don't need help. Sometimes the most dangerous prisons are built with gold bars and maintained by people who claim to love you. My parents rolled their eyes when I walked into that courtroom because they couldn't imagine their controlled, submissive daughter could threaten their empire. But when I spoke my truth, backed by evidence of their crimes and surrounded by allies who'd helped me survive their attempts to destroy me, their world crumbled exactly as it should have. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced family members who used their power or wealth to control your life? Do you know someone who might be trapped in an abusive family situation that looks perfect from the outside? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it opened your eyes to how family abuse can hide behind privilege and status. Please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories about survivors who found the courage to fight back against impossible odds. Share this video with anyone who needs to know they're not alone in their struggle against family abuse, no matter how powerful or respected their abusers might appear to be. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting other survivors who are still fighting for their freedom and justice. Remember that speaking your truth, no matter how terrifying it might seem, is often the first step toward reclaiming your life from people who never deserved to control it. Stay strong, stay safe, and never stop believing that you deserve better than the prison others try to build around you.